Good evening and welcome to 57th Street Books. My name is Leah Schweitz and I'm the Assistant Events Coordinator with the Seminary Co-op Bookstores. Tonight's reading and lecture is part of a series that we do here at the University of Chicago and at the Newberry Library downtown. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight Professor Cass Sunstein. Professor Sunstein is the Carl Llewellyn Distinguished Service Professor in the Law School and with the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. His previous works include Free Markets and Social Justice, Legal Reasoning and Political Conflict, Democracy and the Problem of Free Speech, and Feminism and Political Theory. Tonight, Professor Sunstein will discuss his most recent works, One Case at a Time and The Cost of Rights, Why Liberty Depends on Taxes. Given the timeliness of an exploration into the relations between liberty and government involvement and what this debate means in terms of taxes and rights, Professor Sunstein will be focusing on the cost of rights. As Benjamin Barber has commented, by accepting the primacy of rights without dismantling of government, the cost of rights reestablishes the link between the protection of liberty and a strong democratic government, even as they underscore the essentially public character of private rights. Please help me welcome Professor Cass Sunstein.
Thank you very much. It was, I think, exactly to the day, 21 years ago, that as a law student I wandered into Archibald Cox's office. And Cox, who was and is a pretty happy man, even though this was a few years after the independent counsel discharge, he looked very unhappy. And he said that he was filling out his taxes. And then, as if to cheer himself up, he said, "Learned Hand, the great judge who was his boss, used to say taxes are the price we pay for civilization," he said, trying to cheer himself up. But then he said, "But I think in Hand's day, civilization wasn't quite so expensive." This is a proposal that we should celebrate Tax Day as closely linked to liberty. It's not a proposal that we should have a party with balloons, but it is a suggestion that we should recognize the fact that taxes are a precondition for rights. In the last decades, much of modern political debate has been organized around two oppositions. They've kind of marked the debate over Reagan and Clinton and much more. Many people say they're against government but for rights. And many people say they're against government but for markets. My suggestion is that these are false and misleading dichotomies. That if you're for rights, you ought to be for government and have a smile on your face on tax day. And if you're for markets, you ought to be very enthusiastically for government and think that tax day is a good day for free market economies. Let me give a few examples of why it is that both markets and rights are dependent on government and on taxation. Maybe the most obvious is the cornerstone of a system of individual rights and a system of market ordering. That is the right to private property. A few years ago, there was a terrible fire in the Hamptons in which wealthy people, mostly, who live in the Hamptons, were threatened. And government rode to the rescue with federal and state and local assistance costing over $1 million, in which taxpayer-funded services end up safeguarding property rights, not the property rights of poor people, but property rights of many of the wealthiest Americans. To have a system of protection against private violence and theft, you need a pretty extensive government apparatus. It's possible for private right holders, so-called, to hire their own police forces to protect themselves, and some of them do, but that's very difficult, and unless you have the authority of the state behind you, chances are it's not going to succeed very well. As people in Eastern Europe are seeing, to their dismay, a system of private property depends for its existence on a well-funded government apparatus, and that they don't have. And one reason they don't have private property in Russia is they don't have a tax system that adequately supports protection of private property. Freedom of speech, Americans are used to thinking of as a negative right, a right against governmental interference. But as events in Kosovo and China have shown, freedom of speech is emphatically an affirmative right, a right to governmental assistance, funded by taxpayers. Every tyrant knows that a good way to stop political liberty is not to protect dissenters who are subject to public or private violence. Freedom of speech depends not only on a well-funded mechanism for insulating political dissenters from oppressive critics, but also depends on allowing outlets to be open. When tyrants in China and the Soviet Union wanted to prevent political dissent, one thing they did was to close off the public streets. They would have been almost as effective if they had said that in order to protest here, you have to pay a licensing fee. But in our system of freedom of expression, licensing fees are constitutionally unacceptable, at least in general. The public streets and parks are open to expression, and that means the taxpayers have to pay. A real system of freedom of speech, as opposed to an anarchic system of free-for-all, depends on a well-funded governmental apparatus willing to pay a lot to protect people who are exercising the right to dissent. We're used also to thinking of the right to be free from police abuse as a negative right, a right that has nothing to do with taxpayers funding government services, but instead a right to fend off interference with our normal private rights. But if you think about it for a moment, it's clear that a system of freedom from police abuse costs a lot of money. One thing you have to do is train police officers not to abuse people's rights. Another thing you have to do is to make effective a system for monitoring and punishing police officers who have abused people's rights, and that costs money. A few years ago, I had my car stolen here in Chicago, and a police officer, a great guy, recovered it. And he asked me what I did. I said, with some embarrassment, I teach constitutional law. And I asked him the natural question, does the Constitution or the Fourth Amendment give you any trouble? And he said, no, I didn't violate the Fourth Amendment unless I say I violated the Fourth Amendment. And I never say I violated the Fourth Amendment. This was an honorable person, and the story suggests that any system that's going to prevent police intrusion into the private sphere is going to have to be supported by taxpayers willing to oversee the exercise of police authority. Tyrants know not only that they can suppress speech by closing off streets, they know that they can intrude on private rights simply by refusing to devote resources to controlling the police and training them to respect private rights. That costs money. In Russia, there was a kind of dream, which was that you could have a market economy, a system of free markets, and freedom of contract, if you simply let the government go away, hands off, laissez-faire. What they've found to their detriment is a system of freedom of contract, the kind of twin to private property as what undergirds a system of market ordering. System of freedom of contract requires a pretty extensive governmental apparatus involving courts and deeds and record keeping. You can't have a system of freedom of contract without a pretty expensive apparatus that sets freedom of contract in place and makes contracts something other than just useless pieces of paper. Freedom of contract exists in the United States because of taxpayer-funded services. Freedom of contract does not exist in Russia, and the reason is that they don't have a taxpayer-funded apparatus that makes contracts meaningful in the world. Okay, no balloons on tax day, but an appreciation of the things that taxes do for our liberties. There are a few implications of this analysis, and let me just draw out a couple of them. One is that the negative rights, positive rights distinction, which has bludgeoned our political discourse for the last 20 years, it would be good to get rid of that. People who are dependent on government, like people in the Hamptons, for protection of their property against fire and marauders, enjoy positive rights no less than welfare beneficiaries who are dependent on food stamps or state resources to get by. Wealthy people are beneficiaries of government largesse, thank goodness, as well as poor people. It's not as if the negative rights, positive rights distinction makes sense in coming to terms with rights as we actually live them. In a nutshell, all rights are positive. All of them depend on a government apparatus. It also follows that rights by their nature aren't absolutes, notwithstanding many suggestions by political liberals in the last 20 years. Any right whose existence depends on resources can't be absolute because resources are limited. Hence, in the United States, we have a paper guarantee about unreasonable searches and seizures, but we don't devote all the resources we have to preventing unreasonable searches and seizures, which is one reason why that right isn't absolute. So too with the right to freedom of speech, so too with the right to private property. Rights can't be absolute in view of the inevitable fact of scarcity. It also follows that the seemingly really boring topic of public finance is linked a lot more tightly to the seemingly exciting topic of democratic theory than might otherwise appear. If it's the case that government resources undergird all of our rights, and not just Social Security, food stamps, welfare payments, then it would be very good to expose to public scrutiny those rights that are at stake when the government engages in the actions of someone who is involved in public finance. Public finance, an abstruse topic, needs to be a subject of much more in the way of democratic discussion. We need to know whose rights are being protected, with what level of resources, and whose rights aren't, and why is that? Okay, it follows finally that statelessness, as Kosovo is making very clear, is the real source of rightlessness. It's not government who's the obstacle to rights, it's statelessness. People who don't have a state able to protect them against public and private depredation, those are the real rightless people. What a right holder is, in a nutshell, is someone who's able to draw upon the public fisc to safeguard interests that the democratic process has recognized as worthy of respect. To be a rights holder is to be able to draw on extracted resources from taxpayers and used for public purposes, emphatically including freedom of contract and private property. It also follows, and it's worth underlining this, that wealthy people, even Gates himself, owe a great deal to a collective taxpayer-supported set of institutions, much more so, in fact, than poor people who are dependent on governmental apparatus much more episodically. It's not as if there are two classes of people, the dependent poor and the independent wealthy. The seemingly independent wealthy are made independent, to the extent they are, by taxpayer-funded grants. This is not a criticism of our system, which rewards the wealthy. It's just a suggestion that the wealthy haven't gotten wealthy just by their own actions. They've gotten wealthy with the assistance of a set of institutions that are publicly funded. Okay, I have not claimed that the tax level is right. I think my taxes are a bit too low, but that's just speaking for myself. I don't think that the tax level is in all respects correct. This is not a claim that we've reached the right level of taxation. The claim is both more specific and more general. That Learned Hand, when he said that taxes are the price we pay for civilization, was right, but he greatly understated the matter. Tax Day, April 15th, isn't a reason for a parade. We don't have a big party. We don't have to have a big party, but it would be good to celebrate Tax Day because liberty itself depends on it. Comments and questions? Sam.
Could you expand a little bit more on how the discussion of public finances would relate to rights?
Yeah, what I'm thinking here is that the public spends a lot of money, obviously, today on national defense. We've already spent several times the amount of money spent on the Starr investigation over a set of years on the Kosovo matter. This has been a terrific expenditure of resources, and it would be good if those expenditures that are large and go to some rights, like the Social Security program costs a fortune, and it goes to the protection of some things people consider rights, the rights to receive resources for which you've maybe paid a little bit as a worker, maybe more than a little bit. But there are other programs, like the food stamps program, that is extremely poorly funded, comparatively speaking. In most of the major cities, there are some areas where the police devote a tremendous amount of public taxpayer-supported resources to protection against private violence. And there are other areas where the taxpayers' resources don't go to protection against private violence. So some people are much more vulnerable in their property rights than other people just because taxpayers are supporting their property rights and not others. Now, the claim that the seemingly dull topic of public finance should be kind of linked to democratic theory is that maybe, as insistent a question for a democracy as any is where do we deploy our resources to protect whose rights? Now, that question doesn't have a simple answer. The difficulty is, a simple difficulty, is that our discussion has been clouded and mystified by the fiction that some people are dependent on governmental resources and other people aren't. Now, it may be right to say we should devote a lot of money to protection of property and not so much to protection against homelessness. At first glance, it's not obvious how that sentence could even make sense because the status of homelessness is the status of not having property. So, but you could have that argument, but it ought to be discussed in terms of resources for this, not for that, and not as if there's some opposition between government and rights. I can say that this project owed its origin not to thinking about America, because we take for granted, most of us, the taxpayer-supported services on which we depend every day. And when we fill out our taxes, we don't ordinarily think that this is what they're going toward. We take it for granted. The project came out not of thinking about America, it's invisible to Americans, but think about Eastern Europe, where Russia tried to have a right to a jury trial. They thought that's part of liberty, a right to a jury trial, which Americans seem to think also. The project failed because it took 25% of local court budgets, so they couldn't do it. They didn't have the tax base. I guess I thought when communism failed in Russia that there was reason for tremendous optimism about the gains in liberty and democracy that would come from the collapse of government. What was invisible to people was that the collapse of government was not a recipe for liberty. It was produced another kind of oppression, and it certainly, there's a lot of private violence there, and there isn't a government in place. I mean, there is this guy, Hayek, a Nobel Prize winner, who's the greatest critic of socialism in the 20th century. Margaret Thatcher's one of her very favorite, and Reagan himself loved Hayek. But Hayek didn't think the word laissez-faire was sensible, nor did he think that you could have markets without government. In fact, he said that markets depend on a governmental apparatus as much as any other kind of social institution. So Hayek did believe in what some people now call laissez-faire, but he certainly wouldn't write in the head-clouding, democracy-inveigling way that Hayek's followers often talk in terms of. So that's the sense in which public finance and democratic theory are really closely connected with one another. They're not at odds. Sure.
So when you study Eastern Europe and Russia and countries that have financial difficulties, just how are their judiciaries supposed to be funded and supported if the money is just not there?
It's a real problem. To have a court system in Ukraine, I've talked to some people there, is very difficult. Now, one thing they are committed to is having a system of constitutional rights and private rights which courts will take seriously. They're not so poor that they can't put the skeleton in place. So they do have judicial institutions. Now, a country that is so poor that it can't have judicial institutions, that is since liberty depends on taxes, that is not a free society. They have enough that they've been allocating what little they have to creating basic institutions. Now, there are two problems facing Eastern Europe, both of which we face in much weaker form. One is judicial independence. You have judges who are not subject to political whim. They have a real problem in some Eastern European countries to that effect. Russia is an example where Yeltsin basically runs the Supreme Court. It's not an independent institution. The other is resources. And to deprive a judicial institution of finances makes it go slowly, and justice delayed is justice denied. And if you don't have any law clerks or any clerk who can, help you with documents, then you can't operate as a court, and that takes taxpayer resources. So the way they're handling the problem is to create what we would consider skeletons. Now, that's good. That's a lot better than nothing.
What about in China that the litigants themselves fund the system, that the courts take a percentage of the dispute and controversy, and the court can keep that money, and that's what they use to fund the system?
Right. My understanding is that that's happened in China, and that there have been experiments in this vein in many countries, including the United States, where there are these private litigation services, in the commercial domain. Industries have set up their own private ones. And it's possible to do that. Now, one problem you create if you do that is you make people who don't have resources unable to assert their rights. And so just as a state that doesn't have resources can't protect rights, so individuals who don't have resources can't safeguard their rights. One reason why we don't have, we could imagine, it's kind of an interesting thought experiment. It's like a nightmare, or maybe to some a dream, a system in which each of us paid a pro rata share for each of the rights we enjoy. It would be like a licensing fee. But I think that would have a number, and you could replace the tax system with a licensing fee for all rights. It'd be pretty unwieldy as the tax system is. Pro rata shares would be even messier. And to run that, by the way, you're going to have to spend some money, right, to make sure that there isn't fraud and duplication and so forth. So there are experiments in that vein. Undoubtedly, they're sometimes good. Privatization is sometimes a good idea. If you want to privatize, the taxpayers are probably going to have to help you a little bit. We could imagine experiments in that vein. It raises for the judiciary a particular risk of bribery. I guess you might be nervous of any system in which litigants are handing dollars over to the state in return for justice. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just by way of comparison, what could you say about the South African experience?
Right. Well, I have worked a little bit in South Africa and on their process of constitution making. I guess I would say that it's been amazing, as amazing in its way as our own experience. And one thing that Mandela has been able to do is so far, to put to one side big disputes among diverse people and to get people to unify around practices and rights, despite their disagreements on particular things. So he's made national unity a kind of rallying cry around which diverse people have been able to rally. It's not that different in kind from our own Constitution, which starts out with the words, "We the people," which was that's as stirring as that is in general. It's stirring in a particular way because it was an effort to bypass the "we the states," say the people, not the states created the government. And Mandela's had a similar intuition about national unity because it's not, the whites are doing this and the African, one or another African group is doing this. There's national unity. So I think that's one reason why he's been probably the greatest politician, among other things, of the last 15 years. Okay, in terms of the particular topic of positive and negative rights, so far as I can tell, South Africa isn't generally befuddled by the notion that welfare beneficiaries depend on the state and property owners don't. In at least the general discussions there, such debates as they have are united by a recognition that scarce resources are something on which everybody depends. And the debates over how much to fund for poor people are much more reasonable than our debates. That is, they're debates about whether helping out poor people is affordable and whether it might not create bad incentives for work. Whereas our debates have been much more clumsy about rights for poor people being positive and kind of somehow un-American. There isn't a sense that some rights are un-American and other rights un-African and other rights not. Here we have a sense that, there's been some break in the creation of the welfare state toward an un-American set of handouts. But if we see all of us as the beneficiaries of government largesse, then we're all beneficiaries of something like government handouts. The question is, do we get enough for our money? And in South Africa, generally, those debates have been clear-headed, which is not to say that their policies are always good.
How does a government, which is a creature of political process, serve as the arbiter of freedom without being a violator of freedom?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, the great question is, if government is necessary for freedom, how do we constrain it sufficiently so that it isn't an obstacle to freedom too? And this was the huge question that the framers of the Constitution tried to come to terms with. What they tried to do, I mean, Madison and Hamilton, despite what's frequently said, were not enemies of government. They were going from the Articles of Confederation, where the problem was it was too weak, not that it was too strong. They wanted to create an affirmative government that could actually act. They weren't opposed to government, but they were very alert to the problem you describe, which is the risk of tyranny. And I guess they saw two strategies. One is to diffuse power and to allow mutual checks on the exercise of power, and at the same time to create individual rights, which would operate as judicially enforceable barriers against the abuse of power. Now, in South Africa, something very similar has happened. Not quite the same system as we have, but to the extent that we have liberty in the United States, it's because we know that liberty depends on government, and therefore, thank goodness, have a strong one. But we also know that liberty depends on constraints on government, which are very expensive, and we fund that too.
I just wanted, in the context of that, of this last remark, the remark you just made, there was just a recent Supreme Court ruling that had to do with the Fourth Amendment, I think with invasion of privacy, which allows police officers to make what could be construed more random searches of people, say in a vehicle that's pulled over. And I guess it gives them pretty much what, again, might be construed as more draconic privileges in that area. What do you think of that?
I think it's a complicated one, whether to allow the police to engage in random searches promotes liberty or undermines it. There are both sides, problems on both sides. If police officers are allowed to engage in restrictions on vehicular freedom, let's call it, that's a problem, unless there's reason to believe that people are real criminals. On the other hand, if the police are acting in a genuine random way and aren't singling out particular people for illegitimate reasons, then one thing that police do is protect the precondition for freedom.
It's their discretion.
Well, it depends on what randomness means. I mean, if randomness means arbitrariness, then we have a worse problem than if randomness means every fifth vehicle. I'll give you an example of what I think is legitimate, which is when you go on an airplane, you get checked out pretty carefully. And that's great. That if you don't have a system where the police and the government can guard against terrorism, then there's a problem, not only, security, but liberty. To be able to travel without the police helping you, that's a problem for liberty. So I feel a lot of the Supreme Court's ambivalence about rights that the Warren Court liked, it's not clear that that ambivalence is bad, because the rights themselves, there's liberty on both sides. It's a little like the Chicago gang ordinance, which a number of cities have gang ordinances now. They're extremely controversial. I'm not sure whether they should be upheld or invalidated, but gangs are a real obstacle to liberty if you're living in a poor area where the risk is that you'll get shot. And so to give the police a little more discretion endangers liberty on the one side, but it helps liberty on the other.
Aren't you sort of relying on the individuals of the society to act in a certain manner? Besides the issue of them being told what to do from some sort of a judicial branch. I mean, if a police officer is out there, aren't you basically saying that you think he's going to act correctly, not incorrectly, and you have to give him some sort of leeway?
Well, I think, okay, I guess I think that any free country has a well-funded police force and allows a certain room for police officers to maneuver. They're putting their lives on the line after all, and they're not that well paid. They ought to be more well paid. So there's that. I guess I think that anyone who has a gun ought to be subject to control for the illegitimate use of the gun. And one thing that rights require is monitoring of people with guns, private and public. And that's why the usual way to think about it, which is that we as right holders need to protect ourselves against government with guns, is incomplete. Because one of the ways we would protect ourselves against people with guns is to fund people who are in a good position to protect us against people with guns, which is to say other police officers. I'll tell you a story. I clerked for Justice Marshall, who voted for the Miranda ruling, you know, the very controversial Miranda ruling, and liked it. But one day he was kind of disgusted, and he thought, you know, maybe the Supreme Court's going to get rid of Miranda. But he said, Miranda's good, but, you know, I'll tell you what an effective strategy. And he said in New York there were a bunch of police officers who were beating up African Americans, and the chief of police took them out in the backyard and said, if any one of you beats up an African American, you're fired. Now, he was on the taxpayer payroll. Marshall said that was what did it. And Marshall certainly didn't have a romantic attitude toward anybody, his wife, but toward anyone in government. But he was alert to the fact that the remedy for too much discretion that can be exercised against us, the best remedy is to give someone who is publicly funded the ability to control that person. And that's one thing elections are about. And so, you know, I don't think that anyone is against government intervention. When politicians say, I don't like government intervention, that's rhetoric, and it's misleading and self-congratulatory rhetoric. The deficit ballooned under President Reagan, and I think that's not by itself a criticism of President Reagan. We need to know what the money's going for. And a lot of it went to military preparedness, and that was, you know, extremely important. So President Reagan wasn't against government intervention. He believes in strong property rights. We need government intervention for that. So the real things that divide us have nothing to do with government or government intervention. It has to do with the question of what money should be spent on. That's a good debate to have. I agree with you that because anyone vested with public power can misuse that power, it's very important to spend money to protect them, to protect us against them. And police officers are trained. That's one thing they're trained for. And, you know, this isn't in the least a criticism of police officers. Anyone, a teacher, so to speak, a doctor, anyone, a governor, they all need to be trained. And that's, in the public sphere, that's publicly subsidized. Sir.
Do you see underfunding of public defenders in connection with your central thesis?
I guess there are two, the notion that liberty depends on money has two kind of angles, or rights depend on money has two angles. One angle is that to have protection by the public sphere, which make freedom possible, we need to spend money. Another thing is, another point which you're raising is that people without money aren't going to be able to safeguard their rights even if they have them. And that is a very serious problem, that you can talk all you want about freedom of speech, but if you're impoverished and the government is not letting you speak out, then there's not much that can be done. So I think in principle, it's very important that every person in this society be given the means to protect their rights, in principle. So in principle, the idea of public defenders is not un-American, but closely connected with the core of the American project. Now, the question whether we should fund public defenders more, I'm not sure, because there are other things that can be funded too. And so I guess we'd have to know, with respect to any claimed underfunded rights source, how that ought to be compared with others. Astonishingly, we've never had a debate of that kind in the United States. Yeah.
I guess I'm worried that I find your thesis too compelling, and so I want to know who your opponents are. Now that you've enlisted both Hayek and Reagan to your cause, I mean, who's on the other side, except for the stray anarchist who says no government whatsoever, which is a rare bird.
Yeah. Reagan enlists to the cause in the sense that he was not, despite his rhetoric, anti-government. How could he possibly be? I guess I would say that this idea has two sets of real-world opponents. Those conservatives and libertarians who claim to be against government or against government intervention. Government is the problem, not the solution. They are misdescribing their own position. And they would be much clearer, and we could think about what they were saying a lot better if they didn't have that kind of misleading slogan. If they said, we're for greater funding of protection against private violence and less funding of welfare. It wouldn't fit on the back of a car, but at least we'd know what they're talking about. So I think this has been very damaging when people say, I'm against government intervention, I like rights, I like markets. I don't even think that the small government, large government opposition really is helpful. I was talking to a friend who's in some ways a conservative and a libertarian who said something like what you said. Yes, I agree, liberty depends on taxes, to have private property and freedom contract. There's nothing I disagree with in what you said. I just believe in small government. Now, the question is, small measured by reference to what? I think what he probably meant was small meaning it doesn't have a whole lot of money. It's got enough, but not a whole lot. But whether government is small or large is not well connected to whether it's protecting private property and contract on the one hand or welfare and Social Security on the other. You could imagine a society, let's call it maybe New York, where to have protection against private violence and to safeguard freedom of contract, you need to spend a lot of money. So it's not, to believe in the so-called libertarian program might be to believe in small, that is not well-funded government, but that all depends on the level of activity that you need to prevent. You can't decide that in the abstract. So I believe actually that you're right on the mark, that that what's being claimed here is a truism, and that Milton Friedman and Newt Gingrich and George W. Bush ought to sign on. And what they ought to say is, liberty, yes, depends on taxes. But what I want taxes to be used for is this. Or, I think taxes are too high for the following reason. Now, if they say that, then I have no problem with what they're arguing. But they and others who write learned treatises don't write in those terms. They say government, is the obstacle to liberty. The other opponent is mostly liberals, but some conservatives. So this is kind of anti-liberal as well as anti-conservative. Mostly liberals who talk as if rights are absolute, Many of the most enthusiastic and in a way noble people on talk radio and at, Oxford talk about rights in this way. And they have something in mind, I think, that's correct. But what needs to be added is, we live in the world, not in a fairy tale. And if we live in a world in which we have limited budgets, rights aren't going to be absolutes. And when a child, as happened in a very important and kind of awful Supreme Court case, when a child's head gets smashed by his father, that's what happened in the case. And that person claimed the Constitution was violated because the state didn't prevent it. It could be said, not crazy, the state just didn't have the money to prevent every accident of this kind. It wasn't really an accident, every act of this kind. Now that would make us think of rights a little bit differently. They're not absolutes just because we don't have the resources to prevent all rights violations. So it kind of elevates public expenditures in government, not because, we love everyone who works for government, and kind of makes rights seem less like something in the sky and something that real people actually use. And they aren't absolute. In, certain areas in Chicago and New York, the Fourth Amendment really doesn't mean a whole lot. And how bad that is, reasonable people can dispute. But one reason it's the case is we don't devote the entire budget to preventing police from violating Fourth Amendment rights. Probably shouldn't devote the entire budget to that. So this is more directed against how people talk than exactly what their conclusions are. But I think that's kind of significant, especially around April, when people are in mourning and draping dark colors over their houses because it's such a sad time. It's Americans have a very high level of compliance with the tax laws, voluntary compliance, amazingly high levels, and that's a great achievement. And we also have a pretty good, not perfect, but pretty good level. Of funding of rights, and it's the same achievement.
Thank you.